As we've been doing so far in this class, this section of material is going to focus on the last 30 years of the 19th century. But once again, we're going to approach it from a different angle. And this time we're going to see what's going on with America's cities. And I think all of the stuff we've been talking about so far is leading up to this section on urbanization. When we were talking about industrialization, when we looked at Western expansion and imperialism, we saw how industrialization was shaping these various regions around the United States, as well as pushing the United States beyond its borders to try and control the shipping lanes, especially across the Pacific to the Far East. And when we look at urbanization, we're going to focus more and more on some of the problems that tend to come with this process of industrialization. That these developments, these changes that are taking place in the cities are going to, in some respects, lead to this new reform movement that will bring us into the 20th century called progressivism. Progressives as a movement are very difficult to define exactly what they stood for, but one thing that progressives did hold in common at the beginning of the 20th century is that they were a group of middle-class Americans who were concerned about the indulgences of industrialization and the chaos that they saw developing in American cities. And on the slide in front of you is a picture of St. Louis Union Station, which seems to sort of nicely embody the themes of urbanization that we're going to be talking about in this section. It was built in 1893 and expanded in 1903. And as you can see, it was built in this kind of Romanesque castle kind of format. It doesn't really even look like a train station from the outside, but looks a little bit more like a castle from a Walt Disney film. And I think this is very much intentional. When the firm putting together Union Station in the late 19th century was raising the building, they were trying to create the world's most impressive train station. And they didn't want it to just be the largest in terms of volume, but also making a statement to the rest of the world about what was being accomplished in this city. So certainly it's an embodiment of the sort of hubris that comes with this conquest of time and distance that railroads and shipping tends to create by the end of the 19th century. And the city as well is going to express in a very concrete way the anxieties that also come with this process of industrialization in the late 19th century. So cities are undergoing some pretty rapid changes in the late 19th century. If we look at cities in the end of the colonial period, in let's say 1770 or so, most cities were walkable cities. If you look at Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, for example, in which he describes extensively life in Philadelphia, if he had an appointment across town, he simply walked where he needed to go. But that's decreasingly possible at the end of the 19th century. Cities are growing enormous in size, and there are a few reasons why this is happening. Partly it's because of immigration within the United States, but it also has to do with transformations in industrialization. If you took the first half of this class, you'll know that the first textile mill built in the United States was built way back in 1791. And those early textile mills had to be built where they could be next to energy, specifically the kind of water energy they needed to power the equipment that was inside the factory. But with electrification, with improvements in steam technology, what this does is allow factories to move where the people are. Instead of having to build a factory where the energy is and having to build the housing for all the workers who are going to be working inside that factory, factories could simply locate where there are already larger populations of people and let them have to deal with the housing that they needed. And as factories moved to cities, more people moved to cities, and it became a circular process of drawing more and more people into the cities. And the rate of expansion was quite immense. The technological changes that allowed factories to move to cities were also making it possible for cities to house these ever larger numbers of people who moved there in the decades following the Civil War. If you looked at mass transit during and before the Civil War, it was largely in the form of horse-drawn carriages. The omnibus was the most common form of mass transit, but there are certain limitations to omnibuses. They're essentially large horse-drawn carriages with a big team of horses, but they go to the bathroom everywhere. There was a job in 19th century cities called street scraper, whose job it was to pick up all the horse droppings left behind from these omnibuses. They're limited in volume. Horses only have so much energy, and these omnibuses were simply overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people. And mass transit was more and more needed as more people moved to the cities because as you had a larger volume of people, you had to grow outward. Cities got bigger geographically, grew in size, and the problem became, how do you manage to go to work, go to meetings, and still live in one place? It just became harder and harder to experience the cities as walkable. One solution were railroads, steam trains, elevated trains, came into existence during and after the Civil War. Electrification certainly profoundly advanced the opportunities for mass transit, both in the form of electrified streetcars, as you can see on the slide in front of you here, and then eventually subways. The first subway system in the world was actually in London. It utilized steam trains, and there's a distinct disadvantage to using steam trains underground, which is that they pump out lots of smoke, and it's very hard to be a passenger on one of those subways. Electrification allows for electrified subways that don't produce any smoke to carry passengers from one place to another. Now, elevated trains and electrified subways offer some benefits that allow city dwellers to gain mass transit, keep their sidewalks for walking, and still get from one place to another. Elevated trains, you don't need to reform the urban landscape and create new streets. You just build up. You put the trains up high, and that way people can still walk about freely on the streets below. Subways go the opposite direction to come up with the same solution, that you still want to preserve the sidewalks for pedestrians, and you just simply dig underground, and this allows you to still be able to walk on the surface level, but still have the mass transit opportunities below the ground. Now, along with the expansion of these mass transit facilities, whether it's steam trains, electrified streetcars, what tends to happen is you get a specific kind of suburbanization based on this kind of mass transit. We don't have automobiles yet, at least not in massive numbers. Automobiles are not going to become widely available to most Americans until some innovations made by Henry Ford in the 19-teens. So for the 1890s, 1880s, into the early 20th century, most people relied on various kinds of mass transit. Most of those were some form of train, whether it was a streetcar or a steam locomotive. And that meant that you do have suburbanization, but suburbanization followed the train stations. So instead of having one mass of commercial and residential zoning that extends dozens of miles out into the countryside, you get little pockets around the train stations. Residential areas can form around these train stations as long as people can still walk to the station and get to work on time. Now, essentially, the wealth of the people who move out to these streetcar suburbs goes up the further away from the city you go. People who lived further away maybe couldn't get to work as often. If they were wealthier, they often were able to do more paperwork at home, didn't need to go into work every day. The inner ring suburbs tended to be dominated by people we might think of as the middle class, retail clerks, store managers, accountants, lawyers, those kind of people moved to these inner ring suburbs. And interestingly enough, you can see the remnants of these streetcar suburbs across the St. Louis landscape today. On the slide in front of you is Kirkwood Station, built in 1893. If you follow along the rail lines that go from Kirkwood to St. Louis, you occasionally still see some of the train stations that remain along that line that inspired these streetcar suburbs. If you go to Kirkwood Station and walk away in any direction, most of the oldest homes in Kirkwood are located within walking distance of the train station, and that's no mistake, because the people who moved there in the 1890s or early 20th century had to be able to walk to the train station in order to get to work on a regular basis. So it's interesting to get into this part of the class and be able to look at the landscape of St. Louis itself and be able to see the remnants of this world that has now disappeared, including these streetcar suburbs. Now, the people who moved to these streetcar suburbs were inspired by this cult of domesticity that dominated middle-class values in the remaining decades of the 19th century. These values were both reinforced by the move to these streetcar suburbs, as well as inspiring people to move there in the first place. So these values suggested that men were uniquely created by nature to be able to handle the stresses of the business world, and women were uniquely created by nature to be particularly good caretakers of the home. And in these values was the suggestion that work life, city life was just not the place you wanted to raise children, because the kind of competitive values that came with the business world were not the kind of values you wanted to encourage with young people. You wanted to create a more nurturing, caring environment that seemed antithetical to what was required to be successful in business. And the belief system at the time suggested women were uniquely suited to that. And so these streetcar suburbs sort of cemented in place a value system that valued separating home life from work life. And quite literally, home life was quite separate from work life. Many of the men who went off to work left their homes in these streetcar suburbs, which are sort of seen by them as these oases of virtue out in the countryside, and went into the workplace where they could engage in business and then go back home to their oases of virtue. On the slide in front of you is a picture from a journal published for women, giving advice on how to be particularly good caretakers of the home. This soap ad is supposed to be a humorous ad. This woman is not particularly doing a very good job of being a caretaker of the home. She's letting the dogs do all the dirty work here and not doing anything herself. Now, as cities grew to include more and more people, one solution was to grow outward, and new technological changes allowed them to do that. Of course, the other solution was to grow upward. On the slide in front of you again is another example from the St. Louis area. It was actually recently featured on a PBS series about the most influential buildings in America. It was one of the earliest examples of what we might call a skyscraper. What made the Wainwright building and other buildings like it possible in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was relatively inexpensive steel produced according to the Bessemer system. This steel was used to reinforce these buildings. So instead of being built out of wood and brick, and having wood and brick serve as the support systems, these buildings often had brick facades but had a steel girder interior. When you were building a building out of brick and wood, you were basically restricted to 4 stories. You get much higher than 4 stories, and the weight of the bricks on top becomes so heavy, they simply crush the bricks on the bottom, and the building sort of caves in on itself. But with a skyscraper built out of steel, the sky is the limit. You can build higher and higher because steel can withstand a lot of weight and not crumble. So the slide in front of you here gives you some sense of the kind of immense growth that's taking place in American cities in the late 19th century. I included the statistic on the bottom there about St. Louis. That number for 1870 for St. Louis actually includes the county and the city. Before the city emancipated itself from the county, there wasn't an incredibly clear dividing line over jurisdiction or boundaries. But also St. Louis increasingly is fading from the center of the American business scene by the dawn of the 20th century. It had made its claim to fame on river traffic, and as rail transportation took over, St. Louis increasingly fell by the wayside in terms of being a hub of transportation and commerce. Not despite its best efforts, many of its promoters, as we saw at the beginning of this series, did their best to try and keep pace with the changing world, but other cities like Chicago were rapidly replacing St. Louis's position within the Midwest. As you can see on the slide in front of you, Chicago grew from just under 300,000 people in 1870 to over 1.5 million people by 1900. That's an incredible amount of growth. Even a city like New York, which was already incredibly populous by 1870, doubled in size, or more than doubled in size, by the beginning of 1900. So lots of growth in American cities. Many of these people moving to the cities are moving there for economic reasons, to take advantage of new jobs in these industries. And cities really struggled to keep pace. The reading for this week or one of the readings for this week, is going to focus on the writings of one concerned citizen, Jacob Riis, who's going to describe or attempt to describe to Americans at the time just how problematic America's attempts to keep pace with this rapid pace of change really were. And a lot of these people who live in the cities are recent immigrants to the United States. Again, on the slide in front of you, you get some sense of what immigration looked like. Cities like St. Louis had incredibly large German populations as Germans migrated in the 1840s, particularly after the revolutions in Central Europe in 1848. But in the closing decades of the 19th century, the character of immigration increasingly starts to change. The groups that dominated immigration in the 1840s and 50s tended to be Irish and German. Thus, the immigrants tended to be from Central and Northern Europe. In the late 19th century, the majority of immigrants began to shift increasingly towards Southern and Eastern Europe. So more and more Russians, Italians, people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, these people increasingly dominated the immigrants coming into the United States. And the slide in front of you gives you some sense of the scale of this impact. In 1880, 40% of the residents in New York were foreign-born. In San Francisco, that number was at 45%. Many of these foreign-born residents in San Francisco were not coming from Europe, but were rather coming from Asia. Most of them from China, some of them from Japan. The massive amount of immigration coming from China is eventually going to inspire the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States because many in the West identified the U.S. as a predominantly white and Protestant nation, and were concerned about the number of non-white, non-Protestant immigrants coming into the United States, and they thought this was going to fundamentally change the character of the U.S. Most of these immigrants went to urban areas within the U.S. There are some exceptions. A lot of Scandinavian immigrants coming into the U.S. moved to the Great Plains states to acquire farms out there. But most of the immigrants coming into the U.S. moved to cities. And when they moved to cities, they tended to move to places where they could find not only like-minded people, but people that they already knew, who spoke the same language, which would make it easier to incorporate themselves into this new place they knew nothing about, as well as help them get jobs and other things that they would need to survive. The map in front of you is taken from the city of New York in the late 1900, it says. It gives you some sense of the creation of these ghettos. Now, when historians use the word ghetto, what they're referring to is a section of a city that houses people that are similar to one another in some way or another. It could be the same religion, it could be the same language, maybe the same culture, or their self-identified ethnicity. People who moved to the U.S. tended to congregate with like people. And so you get this ghettoization of American cities where you have various parts of the city that were disproportionately Italian or disproportionately Russian or Polish. You can still partially see that in cities today that have Italian districts or Chinatown. The remnants of these urban ghettos are still visible, although they lack the same intensity they did back then. If you went to an American city in the late 19th century, like Chicago or New York, and you went to the Italian district, there would be quite a few people who didn't speak any English. Most of these people spoke Italian and didn't speak English yet. Certainly you see the remnants of it, but it pales in comparison to the kind of ghettoization that occurred in American cities in the 1890s into the early 20th century. Now, as I said before, city government just struggled to keep up. When you think of basic services like trash collection, police protection, fire protection, most of these services were just inadequate in the late 19th century. If you look at policing, for example, prior to the Civil War, most cities relied upon a sort of night watch system to have police protection in the city. Now, night watches worked largely in a sort of ward system, so each ward had their own elected night watchman, and they relied largely upon volunteers. And as the city grew in these immense scales, the old night watch system just simply proved inadequate to meet the needs of these bigger cities. And it's in the 1870s and 80s when we get modern, sort of bureaucratized professional police forces that take over and eliminate these old night watch systems that just simply could not meet the needs of these new cities. Jacob Riis and others are going to write about the plight of orphans within these cities. The orphanage rates were immense. There's a lot of poverty. People simply did not have the means to take care of their families. Many of the families, everybody worked. And the living conditions were often just abysmal. So the number of abandoned babies was often quite overwhelming. In New York City, the mortality rate for the infants dropped off at the municipal services were simply abysmally bad. It was shocking how many of these kids died. A much higher percentage would die in the wintertime than in the summer because of the freezing conditions that they were often left in. And city government itself is not exactly a model of efficiency and good governance that we might like it to be. Most cities are dominated by what we might call a political machine. And most political machines operated in a sort of quid pro quo arrangement, meaning you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. So a city government would get elected, and they would need people to help them win the election. And they would get these people in the streets, drag folks to ballot boxes, shove the right ballots in their hands, maybe get people drunk and bring them to the ballot box. And those people who helped get out the vote would expect to get something after they won the election. And if their party won, that party would be heavily encouraged by those people who helped to get out the vote to get more jobs to their supporters. And they would do that by making deals with various contractors and businesses. In other words, hey, I will go ahead and make sure that the city hires you to build this new bridge or create a new park, but you're going to have to hire the people I tell you to hire. And that's the way it works. You can get some sense of that too by reading this excerpt from this rather frank interview that George Washington Plunkett gave in 1897. He was a get out the vote guy, an agent within the Tammany Hall political machine in New York. And the interview he gave, which was later published into this book in 1905, is just remarkably frank in how this whole system works. He talks about, since he's so well connected in politics, on the slide in front of you, he's got a lovely quote here about honest graft versus dishonest graft. And in general, he thinks of dishonest graft as somebody who goes into City Hall and literally takes money out of the coffers and puts it in his or her own pocket. Honest graft, in his mind, is somebody who is well connected with the mayor's office, the city council, and because of that, happens to know when the city council is planning to build a new park, and knows where they're planning to build the new park. So before the information becomes public, this person could take that information, go out and buy all the land where the city's planning to build this new park, and lo and behold, when the news becomes public, the value of that land is going to go through the roof, and then he can sell it and make a nice tidy profit for himself. As Plunkett described it, this is perfectly honest graft, perfectly legitimate practices within a political machine. Today we would see that as something like insider trading and incredibly illegal. But this is how city governments ran. And it's going to drive these reformers bananas, these middle-class reformers who often live in these streetcar suburbs. Looking in on the cities, they're going to see this kind of corrupt political machine system in the cities and think things are just a complete mess in there. And they need to clean things up. Under Chester A. Arthur, we're going to see passage of some of the first civil rights. Some of the first civil service reforms, which tend to try and make more professional arrangements. People ought to be experts in their job rather than well-connected in order to become a civil servant. But for many of the urban poor, political machines were a sort of double-edged sword. That yes, they lined their own pockets at the public expense, but if you're a poor person, an immigrant coming from overseas, you don't know anybody, you don't know how to find a job, there's no unemployment office because city services are pretty bad. Where are you going to go to find a job? The political machine is often a place to turn. That if you work for them and you help get out the vote, they often provided their supporters with the kind of work that those supporters needed. So that's the theme we're going to see over and over again when we look at these reformers, especially as you read your chapter from After the Fact. The authors of that chapter tried to highlight the sort of middle-class perspectives that Jacob Riis brought with him when he tried to highlight all of the problems in New York when he was living there in the 1890s. and how, yes, we might sympathize with some of his concerns, but we might also look at him as having concerns that are uniquely inspired by his middle-class perspectives of the late 19th century. Another thing that drove middle-class Americans bananas was the kind of cultural diversity that existed in American cities. There was a lovely book written about progressive reformers in Boston, and one of the more humorous things that progressive reformers wanted to fix was the availability of underwear. Many of these middle-class Protestants looking in on the city were shocked that Italian immigrants apparently did not wear a whole lot of underwear. And they thought this was just scandalous, and so they launched a campaign to try and improve access to underwear. So again, when we look at these progressive reformers, they're going to make some changes. Some of them we'll find positive, but others we might look at and think it's based largely upon their middle-class perspectives and maybe not all that helpful to the people they're trying to help. One thing that shocked Boston's middle-class reformers was how many immigrant women were working outside of the home. They felt the home should be the domain of the woman, where she instills virtue in the next generation. And the fact that so many working-class women were working outside of the home was quite shocking and appalling to many of these middle-class reformers. Some of them were more shocked about the inhumane conditions and felt that this was largely the result of economic disparity that existed within the cities. Others tended to attribute it more to the supposed ignorance of immigrants coming in from overseas who just didn't know how to appropriately organize their families, and thus were not creating the kind of middle-class homes that these reformers expected. And with saloons as well. One of the main progressive campaigns of the 20th century is going to be temperance reform, which will eventually result in the passage of the amendment to the Constitution barring the sale and distribution of alcohol within the United States. And so when progressive reformers looked at saloons in American cities, the tendency was for them to think that these things caused all the problems. If you want to understand poverty, human misery, it all traced back to the saloons. But the reality of a saloon is a bit more complicated in American cities. There certainly were a lot of them. A lot of the big brewers in the late 19th century had their own saloons and worked out deals to try and monopolize access to alcohol in American cities and taverns. But cities were short on expansive meeting places. Homes were tight, they were overcrowded. If you wanted to meet with a large group of people to discuss a labor problem, a problem facing your religious community, where could you go to discuss these things? The saloon offered a rather expansive area where you might actually be able to meet. So again and again, when we look at the cities, when we look at the various problems that progressives think that they see in the cities, some of them are certainly justified and certainly are problematic from our perspective too. But a lot of the things they point to as the problems facing American cities are perhaps less problematic than they tended to suggest. Now, as I said before, one of the reformers you're going to read about this week is Jacob Riis and his famous photographs that he took. And I'll go ahead and save that information for your reading from after the fact for this week. Another reformer who's going to inspire outrage and encourage middle-class people to call upon somebody to do something about this is going to be Upton Sinclair. Now, Americans by 1906 were well aware that something was not quite right in the meatpacking industry. A big scandal erupted in 1898 in something known as the embalmed beef scandal. What happened is a number of soldiers in the Spanish-American War died from eating tainted beef, and an investigation into the matter discovered that various products used to embalm bodies were being used to preserve the meats, and these things were not safe for human consumption and led to the deaths of these soldiers. Understandably, a lot of Americans were outraged, called upon the U.S. government to do something about it. And so Upton Sinclair is not exactly exposing a previously unknown truth to the American public. Nonetheless, the details that he provided were quite shocking to Americans to look into these meatpacking plants. It's a somewhat fictionalized account of real observations that Upton Sinclair made, and he was hoping to inspire amongst his readers a desire to do something to protect the workers within these meatpacking mills. He wanted to show them how terrible the conditions were and do something to protect the workforce. What most readers read when they read The Jungle, however, was not a concern for workers, but rather a concern for their own stomachs, that they were more shocked about what they were putting into their own bodies as consumers than they were about the conditions that laborers had to endure within these factories. Now, this era of urbanization and this inspired reform movement that's going to come out of the problems of urbanization, they're going to create a new movement within Christianity called the social gospel. Up until the late 19th century, Christian evangelists like Charles Finney had tended to make Christianity a very personal sort of issue. You had to make the choice. You needed to convert. This was your decision. God was offering you salvation, and you had to make the choice. Walter Rauschenbusch was a Baptist minister working in one of the poorest districts of New York, and he's looking at the world around him, and he's thinking, this just doesn't fly in this new world that industrialization and intense urbanization have created. He looks around this world and he says, look at these women who are engaged in prostitution. Why are they engaged in prostitution? You could talk to them and tell them it's wrong and that they should not do that. But the reality is that the world around them has given them few options. The poverty, the lack of opportunities for women have put them into a place where they really have no choice but to engage in prostitution. So he says, you could talk to them till you're blue in the face and try to convince them that they're doing something wrong here and that God is calling them to become saved, but unless you change the world around these people, there's no way they can accept God's offer of salvation. And this kind of thinking is going to both inspire the progressive movement and create this new movement within the American Christian tradition that suggests that perhaps the primary thing that Christian reformers should be looking to is not the salvation of the individual, but rather creating a world, changing the environment around which individuals live, so that they have the opportunity to accept God's salvation. It's a kind of Christianity tailor-made for this reformist impulse, which is inspired by a sense of virtuous indignation that they're going to be fixing this world. And this reformed Christian movement gives them the sense that they're justified in their mission.